But as I said, this is not quite sufficient for explaining the decline in fertility rates. There's a lot of other changes going along here. So people are making different choices for families, changes in the way they're raising their families. They're choosing to pursue education. So there's a lot of different variables here that need to be considered when looking at why fertility rates are declining. So this it's been previously established that as population densities increase, fertility rates decrease. But the problem here is that, like, although this correlation has been found, you probably know full well that, like, correlation does not mean causation. We don't really know why this relationship exists. And so we know they're related, but the theoretical work here, there's been very little theoretical work explaining why this is related. And the little bit that has been done has only been done at one time point. But in the non-human animal literature, the experimental work there suggests that this is a causal relationship where they actually manipulate population densities and show that fertility declines in a number of species. So now it's time to look at this in human populations. But first, we should think about why this might be. So what I'm proposing here is that population density will influence fertility rates, such that in low densities, there are, like, and this is all else equal, so we're holding a lot of things constant here, and I'll talk about this a little bit later as well. But in low density populations, there aren't many people per area. So per area, there are more resources per individual. So there's lower competition for those resources within those populations. And so this suggests that people may engage in what we call faster strategies. And faster strategies are where people choose to have families sooner, they have more children, and they don't really go to school, they choose to have families earlier on. Whereas in high density populations, there are fewer resources per individual. And to compete in these environments, to get those resources, you need to be more competitive. And so we propose that under these conditions, people will invest more in themselves. So like getting higher levels of education or invest in other things before starting a family, resulting in them delaying reproduction and having fewer children overall. And so this would be considered a slower strategy. Now, in these environments, we also propose that they invest more resources per offspring because in those environments, in order for their offspring to compete, they also need to have more investment per child. So this is our proposal about why will population density affect fertility in human populations. Okay, but when will this be the case? If you're thinking, yeah, but this might not always be the case, we agree. So bringing back my low density and high density predictions, we only predict that this would be the case in stable and predictable environments. So where you can think that, hey, you know what, 5 years from now won't be so different from now. I can delay reproductions and everything will be fine. Under harsher conditions, where there are high risks of violence, pathogens, and poverty, we don't predict this will be the same case. And because factors like having low GDP, so low resources, high homicide rates, high inequality, high pathogen prevalence, it is much riskier to delay reproduction in those contexts. 5 years from now, you might not be around, you might be sick, there might be a lot of things that happen. So delaying reproduction is riskier and less likely to have the same payoff as in stable and predictable environments. So we predict that the relationship between density and fertility will be reduced in environments that are much harsher. Now, we also make this prediction for a couple of cultural variables, including high religiosity and adherence to social norms, which is kind of like how tight or loose a culture is. So how do you have really strong social norms like Japan, or looser social norms like a lot of the countries in South America? And so we predict that these will be buffering variables because um, they will reduce the effect of density on fertility. High religiosity promotes higher fertility rates often, and adherence to social norms would also predict like population-based variables. So we believe that under harsh conditions and under certain cultural factors will actually reduce the effect of density on fertility. Okay, So the main question for the study is when and why does population density influence fertility over time? And so I got 69 years of data from 174 countries using like finding data sources on the internet. We used a variety of methods and tested alternative explanations, and we also forecasted fertility for 174 countries. I won't be going into all of this today, but if you have questions about like the forecast or anything like that, I'd be happy to talk about them. Okay, so how did I do this? So yeah, I got the data from reputable sources on the internet, like the United Nations for population density and fertility rates, and a bunch of other variables for as controls and or to test the moderating effects that I will be talking about. We used a variety of analytic methods. I won't go into too much detail here, but the main analyses were called multi-level models, where you kind of put the data within country to account for like how the data is distributed in the world. But yeah. Okay. So first I'm going to talk about my main analysis where I was looking at the relationship between density and fertility over time. Now, this is important because although the relationship between density and fertility has been found before in humans, it's never really been looked at over time. So here I looked at both between country effects, so like from country to country or within country. So this within country is change over time, change in density over time, how that influences change in fertility rates over time. And you'll see for lower density is in green and higher density is in orange. And what you can see in this is that the relationship between density and fertility is, like the decline over time is slightly more in higher density countries. So basically fertility decreased more over time in populations with higher densities, both at the between country level and within countries. And this model accounted for 31% of variance in fertility rates, which that
Can
really
I
does.
ask a quick question?
Please.
So the within country splits between low density, is that the countries changing their density from one category to the other over time, or are they all in a stable category and it just changes over time? So in the
We
within country, are
categorize
there
them
are
as
any
low or high.
okay, so the country, no countries in the period being studied changed from low to high or the other way?
No, well, they could have, but we categorized them based on their mean.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
Make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this model accounted for a fair amount of variance in fertility rates. And we use a second method that a different analytic method to see if the results were in the same direction, and they were. In 111 of the 174 countries, we found negative associations between density and fertility. Okay. So this is an animation that somebody on Twitter did for my data, which was really nice. And what this shows is on my x-axis, I have population density. On my y-axis, I have fertility rates. And you could see how fertility rates change over time according to population density for each country included in the data set. And this relationship held for when we included a bunch of different variables in the model, which includes women's empowerment, cultural factors, economic variables, and ecological factors. So the relationship between density and fertility was consistent despite accounting for all of these other things. Okay, so let's look at those moderators where I was talking about why we would find like predicting that the relationship between population density and fertility would be stronger in stable and predictable environments and weaker in harsher environments. So here you'll see my x-axis at the bottom of the screen, it's population density, and my y-axis is births per woman, so fertility rates. And here we're looking at GDP, with gross domestic product, which is a measure of how much resources does a country have. And low GDP is a harsher environment. So if they're poorer countries, high GDP is in orange. And what you can see here is that the relationship between fertility rates and population density is stronger in high GDP countries, so safe and predictable, more predictable environments, richer environments. And it's almost eliminated in poorer countries. So density and fertility is less related in poor countries. Now, for inequality, high inequality is the harsher variable here, which is in orange. And you can see here again in a harsher environment, which is high inequality, the relationship is greatly reduced between population density and fertility rates. A similar pattern for homicide rates. There is a reduction, is a significant reduction in the relationship between population density and fertility under high homicide rates, countries with high homicide rates, and same with pathogen prevalence. So there is again a weaker relationship between population density and fertility when there are high pathogen rates. So again, the relationship between density and fertility was weaker in these harsher environments, which is in line with our predictions. Okay, so looking at the cultural variables, we're looking at two things, like religiosity and social norms. And so again, my x-axis is population density, y-axis is fertility rates. And you could see here for religiosity. Now our prediction was that countries that were higher on religiosity, it would almost be a buffer against the relationship. So density and fertility would have a less of a relationship, a weaker relationship. And we find that here, where under higher religiosity, the relationship between density and fertility is pretty much eliminated, while there is a relationship between density and fertility in low religiosity countries. And similar for cultural tightness. So this is how strict social norms are. And countries with very tight social norms are in orange, and the relationship between density and fertility is reduced compared to those with looser social norms. Okay, so the one last piece of data I'm going to show you is just correlations at the country level. Now we accounted for time in these things, and basically in blue you'll see those predictions in the countries with correlations in the predicted direction. So where the higher density, as density increases, fertility is like lower, it decreases, whereas those in red are in the opposite direction. So either high density, high fertility rates, or low density and low fertility rates. And what you can see here is that the majority of countries were in a predicted direction. So most of them are blue, which is in the predicted direction. There were some that, and most of these reached statistical significance. And there were some that had reversals. Only 37 of these had significant reversals. And if you look at where those reversals are, those countries are often characterized by having harsh or unpredictable environments, like Nigeria, Gambia, and several other countries there. You can see like it's in line with our predictions. Harsher environments, there is even some reversals where fertility rates, as they increased, density increased, fertility increased. So that was in line with our predictions. Okay, so what are our conclusions? So first of all, changes in density over time predicted fertility rates. It accounted for a fair amount of variance. We verified with this with 3 different analytical approaches, and they all came to similar conclusions. And so this suggests that long-term reproductive strategies enhance competitive advantages of offspring in these environments, except under high mortality risks. So basically what this means is that in countries that are safe and predictable, we can afford to delay reproduction and choose to invest in ourselves to compete in those environments. And under higher densities, we posit that this competition is higher. Whereas in low densities, it's lower, so people don't need to invest in as much in themselves to be able to compete and do well. However, under harsh conditions where delaying is risky, there can be significant cost to delaying reproduction. We don't see this relationship. It's often eliminated, or it's reduced, eliminated, or sometimes reversed. Okay, but this kind of addressed why, where, and when, but does not address how. We don't know what's going on in the individual's mind of making these decisions. So what is the individual level mechanisms that go into the decisions of like, do I have children early or delay reproduction? How many children do I have? But we're hoping that this information helps predict demographic trends. So basically, when there are stuff like natural disasters or mass migrations, we might be able to use this information to predict what would happen with fertility rates in those contexts. And we hope that this factors into popular press and policy-based discussions of like why fertility rates are declining, because we're talking a lot about this, but nobody's talking about population density in this conversation. So we're hoping that this kind of factors in the future. But yeah, so this paper isn't published yet. It will be in the next few weeks in a special issue in American Psychologist. Sounds like you guys already have a copy, but it's also online. Thanks to my co-authors, Oliver Sung, Michael Varnum, Igor Grossman. And yeah, thank you for listening. I'm happy to chat.
It's my muted clap. Thank you. Wonderful. So I'll open it up to questions from the students who are here in attendance. I do also have lists of questions from students who aren't here. But first, students who are here, what do we think? Questions for Professor Rotella? I forgot to start the recording until about 30 seconds in. So they missed about on the recording, they'll miss about the first 30 seconds of your presentation. So the people who are here got live exclusive information.
That's all good.
Okay, we're not getting a lot of chats from students who are here, so let me go to my list of questions. So your final point, or one of your final points there, students were kind of asking for an elaboration. They basically said, and I love that students are thinking this way, thinking about Tinbergen's 4 questions, it's clear that you have a functional story about the trends that you're documenting. They're curious about ontogeny, they say ontology, but I think it's ontogeny that they mean, right? Ontogeny is development. What's ontology? That's something else. Anyway, what do you have any speculations as to a developmental story? Growing up in high densities or anything like that?
So you mean like the development component, not the phylogenetic component, right?
Yeah, I think the question's about develop. I'm not reading word for word, but yeah, the effects of living in a denser population. They speculate, for example, growing up in a denser population leading to a weakened desire to have children, as an example of a possible developmental mechanism.
I'm
Do you
not
have
sure if
anything?
it might weaken the desire to have children. I wouldn't be surprised if you see more people choosing not to have children in highly dense populations, but I think the bigger thing is like it's not about the reduction in wanting children, it's like delaying reproduction and having fewer, like it's like over time, but they still want to have children on average. And for the developmental thing, I think we get a lot of like it's all about input and like you get to know your environment. You get to see what it takes to be in that environment. And often in bigger cities, things are more expensive. You need more things to get resources. So you need more money to rent a place. You need more money to buy. You need more of this. In order to access this comfortable lifestyle, you need to invest more in yourself, to go get an education, spend more time developing your skills, or whatever it might be, to get the job that will allow you to be able to be at least semi-successful, have a comfortable life in that environment. Otherwise, it'd be a lot more of a stressful life if you do not choose that. And you do see that. You see the greater variation. And I think that there is like kind of a feedback. You understand this, you get to know yourself and your skills, and then you kind of pick a pathway in life and you choose to go that way or another. And in that more salient in higher dense environments and in lower density environments, when there's kind of like a lower barrier of entry to a comfortable life because things are cheaper. There's and stuff like that. I hope that somewhat addresses your question, but it's kind of like there's
Yeah.
a lot of input and information, and we gauge it to make our decisions.
Yeah, so Professor Mishra joined our class a couple weeks ago and talked about relative deprivation. You're broadly familiar with that body of work.
Yeah.
And kind of the chatting with the class, one of the things is like, do you guys think about housing prices? And some students chimed in and were like, yeah, like we don't think we're ever going to be able to buy housing. I'm just going to be stuck living with my parents forever. It kind of
Mm.
sounds like you're hitting a similar theme here, where like population density combined with kind of escalating resource prices just
Mm-hmm.
makes some types of things seem insurmountably far away, like the excess resources needed to support children, or to buy a home. Like, yeah, I'm trying to make connections between what students
Mm-hmm.
talked about before and this. They do seem all somewhat intertwined.
Yep,
um
I would agree.
Questions, thoughts from students?
if you think about them, like access to housing is an access to resource, and there is a greater barrier to entry to that resource in higher dense environments, as I'm very aware of in London.
Yeah. Here's another one that I suspect is going to be kind of speculative again, but I thought it was an interesting question. So, I should, by the way, give credit. That last question was from assignment 2, group 20. Nice question, assignment 2, group 20. This is from assignment 2, group 14. In racially diverse countries, were there, or if you didn't look into it, would you expect there to be different average fertility rate, even in the same population density, and or how is the relationship between, actually, wait, no, these are two different questions. Sorry. Basically, I mean, the question's about racial diversity, but you might ask other types of diversity. Does the within country diversity have any part of the story, do you think?
I think the more salient question here is about inequality. So it's not specifically about racial diversity, but often racial diversity is correlated with inequality. So I'll be talking about it from an inequality point of view. So I do think so, yes. And in the past 2 years, there's been like an unprecedented amount of like resources shifting from the lower classes to the 1%. And so inequality is being exacerbated. And when you have like that amount of inequality, there are different classes of people where those are very rich and their lives are very predictable, very comfortable. You'd expect lower fertility rates because they can afford to delay reproduction and without any stress. For those that are at the lower levels of inequality, well, that is a that harsh and unpredictable environment. You might face job loss. You have a lot less certainty. So in countries like the United States, where there is this huge divide between the two, you would expect that yes, within country there will be different strategies based on classes of people and resources to be able to insulate from threats and stuff like that. And I would predict that to be the same in other countries like Nigeria, who's also very
So I just lost Professor Rotella. Is that just me or is that everybody? Can any students hear me right now?
It's everybody.
Okay, so the Atlantic Ocean has just interfered with our learning environment here. That's unfortunate. Well, we'll wait a minute to see if she can rejoin us. Aha. Looks like we've got her back. Or she's trying to rejoin us. There we go. Okay. The Atlantic Ocean gives her back.
well, apparently I was still able to hear you and I was access to the meeting, but you guys couldn't hear me.
Yeah, you froze at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But I lost track of where we were.
We're talking about inequality and the question about racial divide.
Yeah, I mean, so presumably the exercise that you did here could be done like on the United States, analyzing different states,
Yep.
and then the inequality variable would probably function similarly to what you observed in the international comparison. At least that's a speculation. Somebody could do that as follow-up work.
I would make the same predictions at the state level.
Yeah.
Although some of them might be less evident, like passage and prevalence, because there's just less variation in the United States compared to like between countries.
Yeah. So another question from that same group that I think is an interesting one, probably relates to some of what you were talking about, cultural variables, where you were using religion as an example of a cultural variable. Question is, how is the relationship between population and density and fertility impacted in more technologically secluded societies like Amish or Mennonite, for example? Any thoughts on that?
I don't think technology has a huge bearing on the relationship between density and fertility. I would look at more of the population specific characteristics. And those populations are often living in low density environments, high religiosity. So I would expect that to be like consistent with like the low density predictions.
So
Um,
technology may or may not be correlated with one of these other meaningful variables, but you're kind of skeptical
yeah,
that technology itself is a meaningful variable. Now,
yeah.
technology that might give people like a sense of broader resource trends, um, I mean, maybe this starts to get into whether it's like ecologically valid cues of population density versus like technologically mediated cues of population
Hmm.
density or resource scarcity. Maybe there's something there, but we're
Yeah,
probably at the bounds of our speculative capacity here, right? Like this isn't something that you can
yeah.
directly speak to.
Well,
Yeah,
given that, like, if you look at just the trends that I showed with like the demographic transition happening over the past 500 years, where technology was absent and for the most part for that trend. So it's happening in the absence of technology. I
right.
wouldn't be surprised if technology does amplify it a little bit. Actually, Oliver Sung and Michael Varnum have a paper where they did one experiment where they gave basically newspaper clippings. They were like fake stories, but one really emphasized population density, the other one didn't, and students reported wanting to start families a little bit later, and I think smaller family sizes and the high density manipulation wasn't a huge effect, but there might be something there. But I think this effect's happening in the absence of technology, anyways.
Cool. Oh, I see a question from Morgan. What do you think, Morgan?
I was actually wondering if you noticed any differences within countries that had a different predominant religion. So if there was any difference in that buffer with a different dominant religion in a specific culture.
So we didn't look at that. We only looked at like levels of reported religiosity. So I can't really speak to the characteristics of different religions, but I will say the majority of dominant religions do have like rhetoric around families and family size to have more children, don't use birth control and stuff like that. So when it comes to fertility rates, we would make similar predictions for the dominant religions. But unfortunately, I can't really speak to like
It,
specific countries because we didn't look at that. We just looked at people's reported levels of religiosity, like how religious are you versus what religion are you?
I mean, that would seem to suggest that if there are differences among religions and how much they emphasize, having babies and building families and stuff, that would probably be the primary variable of interest here.
Mhm.
And to the extent that religions happen to differ in that, you would think that would be what would probably be driving it.
Yeah, definitely. And like all the Abrahamic religions, like Christianity, like like yeah, most of those religions do have some rhetoric around it, which are the dominant ones around the world. So I wouldn't have very solid predictions about um, I would think all the predictions would be in the same direction. Maybe the degree might be different depending on how they're talked about within those religions. But yeah, you'd still make similar predictions for the dominant ones.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Morgan. Any other questions, comments, ideas from students?
It was a good question though.
Okay. Okay, another question from students who aren't here, but so this is from assignment 1, group 5.2. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed how and when we are able to socially interact. After doing some further research, we learned that birth rates have decreased since the pandemic began. How do you think COVID-19 has affected the relationship between population density and fertility?
That is a very good question, and I don't really have an answer for it. Yeah, social cues are greatly reduced, but it also like the fertility rates could just be like there's fewer mating opportunities under lockdown. Um, so I don't know if it'll speak specifically to density because density didn't have much change. If anything, people moved out of the cities a little bit, but it really didn't change too much throughout the pandemic from year to year. But yeah, I think that there'd be other factors that would be more responsible for the decline in fertility rates, just like fewer mating options.
A bunch of us are sitting here thinking, tell me about it. Morgan, do you have another question, or is that just hand still up maybe?
Sorry, that's an accident.
No, okay, no worries, no worries. Um, okay, so totally shifting away from that topic, just a couple of questions about the eyes effects paper. So first thing I'll say is that paper was on a list of like suggested papers that students could choose. They had other options, of course, including going off of the list. Not the most popular choice, that one.
Okay.
And I can't help but kind of relate that to the general problem of publication bias in general, where null results and non-replications aren't as fun to read. They're not as sexy. So
That depends on who. I found that one got much more Twitter reactions than I would have expected, because social psychologists love saying this didn't work.
yeah, that's kind of where I was gonna go, is that like, yeah, it got a ton of love on social media that I can't help but think, yeah, is kind of a backlash against the exact phenomenon that I was describing there. So maybe you could just talk for the class generally about what you, maybe not even this effect particularly, but like the history of popular effects, and then like null results being buried, and then you published this null result and it got some love. Like that. What, how does that whole story look to you, maybe like personally, and like a broader view on it?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. So I bet that most people here are familiar with the replication crisis, because if you're from Guelph, like profs love to talk about the replication crisis since I started there. Quite the advanced department on that spectrum. Most departments don't talk about this nearly as much. But basically, it's where a lot of the classic effects in psychology have people been trying to redo the same experiments, and they have not been finding the same effects. And then the question goes to why? What changed? And part of it is due to poor methods and practices. So a lot of psychologists practices in the past would just, put a lot of things into a study and see what shakes out, analyze it a bunch of different ways, and only report what works, and low sample sizes and stuff like that. And so the eyes effects, where this started, was like they had, I believe the original paper had a pretty decent sample size, but it's been studied many times, and it's one of those weird stories where some work and some don't. So there's a lot of variation there. Whereas there's other effects where, like power posing, if you guys aren't familiar with it, is basically this, like you stand like this and you're like, I'm powerful, and it makes you feel better. That effect was found not to replicate at all. And it's one of the rare occasions where the psychologist behind it took like owned up to it and said, you know what, this didn't work, that, and now we should stop using this. So where am I going with this? So basically, there's a wide variety of studies that replicate, that don't replicate, or sometimes there's mixed stories. Now, with the eyes effect, it's definitely a mixed story. We're trying to figure out when and why does it work, or does it not work? And I think this is partially why it got so much social media attention, because there is such a mixed story. And social psychologists, especially those that are active on social media, tend to be very in the know of the recent developments in psychology. So the ones that are like, they're aware of the replication crisis, they're aware of a lot of the difficulties going on in the field. Those that aren't on Twitter, I would say there's a lower awareness of this and lower interest in it. But given that population, that whenever there's non-replication, people like to know very, very quickly. And yeah, I'm kind of going all over the place because it's a very broad question you asked.
Yeah. I mean, I've been hitting themes about replication and generally being skeptical of results until you've seen more replications and that kind of thing. So to some extent, I just wanted an authoritative person outside of me to share some thoughts on the matter, and you're well positioned to do so, having led this non-replication.
Yeah, I have two papers on non-replications, and I find that they both received a fair amount of attention, and it's because of the bias of social media and who's on there, but also I think people are interested in like, frankly, there's an individual motive, right? You don't want to be studying something and it not work out. And so awareness really matters. There has been like grad students' careers have been just lost because none of the results worked out in the past because this well-established effect, they're studying it and nothing's working out anymore. So what's going on? So people do want to know what works out and what doesn't.
Yeah, you do hear tons of these stories about people saying, I basically spent my entire graduate training trying to replicate this classic effect that everyone knows is true, and I couldn't do it. And that just clearly meant there's something wrong with me as a researcher that I couldn't do it. When no, there was nothing wrong with you as a researcher. There was something
Yeah.
wrong with the entire field, essentially.
Well, that happened to me. Two of my papers out of my PhD, right, were non-replications. I'm just lucky enough to be in a time where the replication crisis is recognized and they're publishable at this point in time.
Yeah.
Prior to me, less so.
So both on that paper and the first one that you presented and talked about, you showed a beautiful, really impressive data visualization that you said somebody just shared on Twitter. Here you're talking
No, he
about,
just asked about data.
pardon?
So basically what happened was that he had a thread being, he animated something. He's like, if anybody else has any data, and then we just sent them the link to our paper and he animated that for us.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, I mean,
Right?
generally, like using Twitter or other social media to promote research, to share research, to learn about research, like, sounds like you're really working that tool very effectively.
I'm trying to. I'm not the most effective at it, but it is a huge, resource. Got feedback. So part of open science is like posting preprints, which is kind of like when you have your paper together, post it online, you could get feedback from it. And I posted this, shared it on Twitter, and I got feedback about some things to modify, which is super valuable. And this paper isn't even published yet and has 5 citations, mostly because it's been shared on social media. So there's a lot of benefits to it, and you communicate and you hear different people's ideas, and it can lead to better papers overall and more resources like, cool animations. More, I've also gotten collaborations through Twitter because, people are interested in what you're doing with that.
Nice.
With that said, there's also a double-edged sword because sometimes people can't get a hold of the research and it can go towards a group of people that are less I don't know, savvy about it and get a lot of things. Like, for example, when I was giving this talk, there was somebody who retweeted, I can't remember what the hashtag, but the hashtag was something like negative about fertility rates. And it got into a whole group of people that were like, really like, yeah, it was a very different environment. Really savvy about this research. So it can be detrimental as well if you take like, I don't know how
So
else to
like
describe it. It wasn't
picked up by a political cause that maybe you're not
pretty
behind, and
much,
that made you
It was something
uncomfortable. I
like
see.
wanting to increase numbers or reduce numbers. I don't remember, but it was something like, there's a whole thread of people just commenting on the idea because they haven't read the paper
Right.
and often misinformation.
Okay. I see.
So there is a
Okay. So,
double-edged sword there, so you have to be careful.
right. Any other questions or thoughts from the students who are here? One more question I had from students who are not here. You talked about it briefly. How did you decide where to get the data for the paper? Like 170 some country, or like hundreds of, over 100 countries, I forget, 130 something countries, 70 some
174.
years of data. Presumably that is going to involve like multiple different sources or evaluating different
Nope.
possible sources. No, all one source?
Yep. So it depends on the variable. So basically our 2 main variables were population density and fertility rates, which we got from the United Nations reputable source. And we just scraped the data from their website.
Hmm.
The others are much more on average like single point estimates, and so we just got from other reputable sources. So like precipitation rates, climatic stress, human development index, which is gender inequality. We just got like the more recent one as a proxy to see if it related to it, because those data sets are much less complete. There's not 69 years of data on like the human development index, or even Gini, like inequality. So we use those as moderating variables, just using a single time point estimate as a proxy.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, so you just look at the sources, where they're from, where they're saying getting their data from, and then scrape the website, which is often the most difficult process.
So one last question for you. In this course, I've tried to encourage students to kind of think broadly about how social psychology relates to other areas of study. I know that you think very interdisciplinarily, if that's a word. I encourage students to like check out your website before this. It's all over your website that you want to think interdisciplinary. Like this, the population density and fertility thing strikes me as very interesting. Like, is this a social psych paper? Do you think? Is it like? How do you think about your work as it relates to disciplines? Maybe that one specifically, or more broadly, where does social psych fit into that paper and among your other interests?
So, okay, I'll start with like, is this a social psych paper? I think it's a paper characterizing a social psych phenomenon, but it's not a social psych paper. So basically, this is, I believe the mechanism here responsible for this, the individual decisions, is based on social psychology, population density. And individuals are making these decisions, and it's about perceptions. We don't talk about the mechanism specifically, but it's really about that concept, that like population density influences people's decisions to have fewer children, or maybe even decisions is the wrong word. It just influences people's behaviors to have children. So fundamentally, that is the idea, which I believe is pure social psychology in that context. But with that said, we're looking at the reason behind it from a broader lens. So we're looking at cultural psychology. So like, and cultural change over time. We're taking ecological approaches, looking at ecological variables and variation in that. So this is a very interdisciplinary to understand a fundamental social behavior, in my opinion. So yeah, and this is a question I get a lot about, how does it fit in with my work, and how do I describe my work, because I do study a lot of different things. But broadly, I say I study social competition, so social cues, and how people compete and different strategies that compete. And I take a few different theories to kind of understand these. My variables might change, but broadly, I'm studying how social competition influences people behavior, whether it is observation or like cues of density or whatever else. They still influence how people are competing, when they will compete, and why they will compete. Does that kind of get at your question?
Yeah, it
It's
does.
hard for me to find a home.
Yeah, fair enough. One more thing, maybe that, like, kind of following up on that, like, I think maybe the title of your position or department involves health.
Mhm.
Like, do you think that that paper specifically bears on health implications in some way? Would that maybe be just like a broader stretch? Like, what does it say about the health of humanity? If our, or like, do you think there are health connections with that specifically?
Tangentially, yeah. For this one, it's just because health is related to environmental harshness and predictability, right? If in harsher environments, like if people would have risk of dying or getting sick, well, we wouldn't have the same predictions, but they do.
Right.
And so fertility rates will be directly related to that, but it's not specifically the focus of this paper. Yeah, but yeah, it has relations there. But
Well,
mostly I'm a social psychologist. When I study health, I basically look at how social effects influence health outcomes.
Professor Amanda Rotella, thank you so much for joining us. Lovely to have you for a chat at this ungodly hour of 8:30 in the morning, our time. You are our last guest expert, and I really should have thought sooner to draw people from your side of the world, where it's a decent time of day to be having a
Yeah, just after
conversation
2
like
p.m. here,
this.
so a little bit
Yeah.
easier.
Thank you so much for joining us. Students are glad you were able to join us for this. I'm going to stop the